Sylvester Stallone, the legendary action hero recognized by millions around the globe, found himself at the center of one of the most amazing, heart-stopping airplane moments ever witnessed. It all started as a routine flight, a simple hop from the bustling heart of Los Angeles to a quieter destination. Yet what unfolded in midair would leave an entire cabin speechless. An astonishing, almost surreal event played out in real time. And for many who were there to see it, it became the greatest experience they would ever share. But the unbelievable part? That single act of kindness, one selfless gesture, unleashed a series of revelations that no one saw coming. Los Angeles International Airport, LAX, crackled with the usual energy of hurried travelers. The hum of announcements echoed through wide corridors, and every few seconds the overhead speaker would call for a final boarding. People navigated around each other, sometimes spilling coffee or juggling their carry-ons as they made their way to security lines and gate areas. Amid the sea of passengers, Sylvester Stallone moved inconspicuously. He wore dark jeans, a comfortably fitted jacket, and a pair of aviator sunglasses that helped keep him just anonymous enough. He had endured countless flights and paparazzi ambushes in his life, but that morning felt surprisingly calm. Perhaps it was because most travelers were consumed by their phones or their own frantic schedules, paying little attention to the casual man strolling by. As Stallone reached his gate, an unassuming sign marking the entrance to his upcoming flight, he noticed that first-class passengers had already begun boarding. With a quick nod to the attendant scanning tickets, he stepped down the jet bridge, occasionally glancing back to make sure nothing unusual was happening behind him. It was a routine flight, and he expected nothing more than a quiet journey where he could relax for a few hours. The first-class cabin, partially filled with travelers accustomed to luxury, glistened with sleek leather seats and the faint scent of cologne mingling with the cool airflow of the aircraft's ventilation system. Stallone took his place in seat 2A. He settled in, careful to stow his belongings and mentally prepare for takeoff. As the remaining passengers filed in, Stallone's gaze wandered. People scrolled through their devices, adjusted their seatbelts, or tried to find space in the overhead compartments for their carry-ons. Then something caught his attention. An older man, noticeably weary, was shuffling slowly down the aisle. This individual looked to be in his late 70s with a face etched by time. His posture hinted at decades of strain on his back and knees, and every shaky step he took down the narrow cabin walkway seemed like a tremendous effort. A cap, worn with pride, sat atop his head. Its embroidered emblem silently announced that he was a Vietnam War veteran. The rest of his attire was modest: an old pair of trousers, sturdy shoes, and a well-worn duffel bag hanging precariously off one shoulder. Despite the soldierly grit in his eyes, there was an undeniable exhaustion about him, as though life had been steadily chipping away at his physical reserves. A flight attendant moved in to assist the veteran, but he waved her off with a dismissive gesture. He seemed determined to maintain his independence, no matter how burdened or pained his steps appeared. Other passengers in higher fare rows barely looked up, retreating into their own distractions, but Sylvester Stallone noticed. He observed the slight wincing each time the older man shifted, the subtle twinge of sore joints that had no doubt carried him through rougher circumstances long ago. Realizing that the veteran was destined for the economy section in the rear of the plane, and that every additional step appeared to cost him dearly, Stallone made a decision. In a swift motion, he unbuckled his seatbelt, rose to his feet, and signaled the flight attendant. In a matter of seconds, there was a quiet pause in the first-class cabin. Heads turned, if only briefly, as they watched a man typically associated with blockbuster glory and Hollywood fame relinquish his own plush seat. The older traveler at first was taken aback. He had made peace with walking all the way to the back, fully prepared for a cramped ride. Yet here he was with a sudden opportunity to settle into a large, comfortable seat near the front of the plane. People in the vicinity became aware that something out of the ordinary was happening. The hush in that small pocket of the airplane was thick with curiosity and respect. Although no formal announcement was made, murmurs circulated. A few onlookers offered smiles of encouragement and gratitude, appreciating the kindness they were witnessing from a star many only knew through the lens of movie screens. The veteran man hesitated. His pride wrestled with his physical pain. Ultimately, he accepted the offer, shifting with obvious relief into the seat Stallone had just vacated. The tension in his legs and the tightness in his shoulders seemed to soften the moment he eased into the comfortable cushions. A gentle applause trickled through the cabin, an unspoken tribute to the generosity that had just been shown. Most of those clapping were from nearby seats, though the positive energy rippled forward and backward through the rows. Even some of the flight attendants paused to take note, their usual pre-flight bustle slowing to acknowledge the moment of humanity unfolding right in front of them. Stallone, now ready to head to a seat farther back, nodded in appreciation of the modest applause. He was no stranger to public accolades, but this felt different. Far more intimate than a glowing movie review or a standing ovation at a premiere. Just as the flight seemed to return to its regular rhythm, a passenger situated a few rows behind the veteran suddenly stood. He appeared to be in his early 40s, clean-cut, and dressed in office casual clothes suitable for a business trip. But something was off. His gaze was locked intently on the elderly man who had just sat down. Color drained from his cheeks, and the look in his eyes suggested he'd just witnessed something he could hardly process. There was a sense of collective anticipation swirling in the air. Stallone paused as he, too, noticed the man's reaction. The cabin's chatter died down yet again. Some travelers stopped rummaging through their carry-ons to see what had left this passenger so visibly shaken. The middle-aged man took a hesitant step forward. His lips parted slightly as though he were on the verge of revealing something deeply personal. He seemed to recognize the veteran, not as a random older traveler, but as a piece of a puzzle he had been attempting to solve for years, maybe even his entire life. All around, people looked on, drawn in by the unspoken drama that was building at the front of the plane. Whispered questions rose. Was the man ill? Had he forgotten something? Why was he staring at the older gentleman with such intensity? Even the flight attendants at the galley craned their necks, uncertain whether they should approach or wait to see what was about to transpire. From Stallone's vantage point, it felt like the calm before a storm of emotion. He sensed that something extraordinary was unraveling, something far beyond a simple seat upgrade or a polite gesture of kindness. The older man, equally puzzled, studied the passenger standing in front of him. A thick tension pulsed between them, tethered by a shared, unspoken link to the past. Gradually, the younger man found just enough composure to close the distance by another step or two. His knuckles whitened as he gripped the back of a seat. A wave of raw emotion washed over his face, and he seemed to struggle, moment by moment, to keep from completely breaking down. Everyone nearby could see that whatever was about to happen, it wasn't trivial. There was no confusion, no animosity, only a heavy wave of realization that played across the younger man's features, as though he had just discovered a vital clue in a long-running mystery. Observing this, Sylvester Stallone lingered in the aisle, forgetting his own disrupted seating arrangement. He had acted simply to ease a war veteran's journey, never expecting his decision to trigger anything beyond relief for an elderly stranger's tired bones. Yet something momentous was brewing, something possibly older than the man himself, perhaps stretching back decades into the annals of American history. Every passenger who had noticed the exchange fell silent, engrossed by the tension that hung in the air like a secret about to be uncovered. Even the overhead announcements, the usual routine about stowing items and preparing for takeoff, felt distant and inconsequential. Flight attendants looked on, unsure whether they needed to intervene or simply bear witness. From the back of the plane, a few curious passengers stood up slightly, peering over the tops of seats, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever was unfolding up front. The interior lights of the aircraft seemed to beam down with added intensity, as though focusing on the spot where these lives were intersecting. No one had the full picture yet. No one could guess the magnitude of what was about to be revealed. But clearly the middle-aged man had recognized something, a clue or a memory triggered by the veteran's face or perhaps by the insignia on his cap. It was as if the path of fate had led both of them here on this very flight, shepherded by the simple kindness of Sylvester Stallone. The hush throughout first class and likely well into business and economy was intense. People who would ordinarily be swiping through social media or checking emails found themselves transfixed on a moment that defied modern digital distractions. Every so often, someone would lean over to whisper a question to a spouse or a friend, only to shrug in bewilderment. The veteran himself seemed both curious and a bit uneasy at the stranger's unwavering stare. His hands rested on the armrests of the plush seat he had just been gifted, clearly appreciative of Stallone's generosity, but now also concerned that something far more complicated was at play. Sylvester Stallone, occupying a standstill in the aisle, found his heart pounding with anticipation. In all his years of experiencing dramatic moments, both on screen and off, he recognized that this was real life at its most profound. He could practically sense the weight of whatever history was about to erupt in front of everyone. Before anyone could fully process the situation, the younger man's eyes brimmed with emotion. He appeared on the verge of speaking, of explaining how he knew the older veteran or why this chance encounter was so monumental, but his words stuck in his throat. Several rows away, someone covered their mouth in shock, sensing the intensity of the moment. Another person turned off their phone's music, drawn in by the nearly tangible tension. And at the center of it all was Sylvester Stallone, quietly realizing that his simple offer of a seat had become the catalyst for something that felt almost miraculous. A convergence of stories spanning decades. Just then, the jet engine spooled a little louder, indicating that the crew was preparing for takeoff. The cabin lights blinked slightly, reminding everyone of the practical reality that this plane was about to lift off the runway. Yet nobody's attention wavered from the silent drama playing out between the young man and the war veteran. The plane's engines droned with a steady hum, but inside the cabin, an incredible tension gripped every passenger's attention. Sylvester Stallone remained standing in the aisle, having just offered his plush first-class seat to an elderly Vietnam War veteran. Nearby, a man in his early 40s, a stranger to Stallone, had gone pale the instant he laid eyes on the older traveler. No one on board could have predicted the astonishing turn of events about to unfold, and yet everyone felt the emotional charge in the air. In the space of moments, this flight had transformed from ordinary to extraordinary. As the airplane door sealed and the flight attendants made their final safety checks, passengers in first class and beyond were riveted by the stillness between the veteran and the younger man. It seemed as though they recognized each other, yet neither had spoken more than a handful of words. Stallone's spontaneous act of generosity had triggered a cascade of emotions that were now vibrating through the entire cabin. Even the ambient noise, a few people rustling magazines, the overhead bins being closed, couldn't distract from the sense that something deeply personal was being revealed. Minutes earlier, Stallone had relinquished his seat to provide relief for a war veteran whose unsteady steps hinted at lingering physical pains from battles fought long ago. That unassuming action instantly changed the flight's atmosphere, prompting heads to swivel and a smattering of applause to break out. But the real impact was yet to come. This newest development, an emotional encounter between two strangers, felt like the second chapter of a story already laden with significance. Nobody spoke. Nobody dared interrupt. The younger man, visibly overwhelmed, appeared locked in a silent struggle to gather his courage. From the outside, onlookers might have assumed he was about to deliver shocking news or ask a question that would unravel layers of buried history. The veteran, still settling into the luxurious seat he never expected to occupy, studied the man's face with equal parts curiosity and hesitation. Meanwhile, Stallone's quiet presence stood as a reminder that life's biggest moments can spring from the smallest gestures. At last, the younger traveler forced out a few halting words, revealing that he recognized the insignia on the older man's cap and had reason to believe it tied directly to his own family's story. The hush that settled over the rows closest to them became almost tangible, as if the entire aircraft was collectively holding its breath. Those few words alone were enough to change the veteran's expression. Initial confusion gave way to cautious understanding. He acknowledged that he had served in the same military unit the younger man's father once belonged to. That revelation alone might have been meaningful in any other setting, but here, thousands of feet above the ground, the emotional weight was magnified. Some of the passengers seated just behind the scene reached for tissues, either out of empathy or sheer anticipation of the heartbreak or relief that might follow. The flight attendants, including those who had originally been bustling up and down the aisle with pre-departure checklists, slowed their steps. They too sensed that a profound connection was being reestablished after decades in limbo. The younger man began to describe how he had spent his entire life knowing only fragments of his father's story. Each recollection had been pieced together from secondhand accounts, letters, and official documents that painted an incomplete portrait of a soldier who never returned home. Details had been lost over time, and genuine first-hand information was painfully scarce. Now, by an incredible stroke of fate, he found himself face to face with someone who had not only served alongside his father, but who might have known him as a friend. Listening intently, the veteran grew somber. Without the need for explicit explanation, he hinted that he had once been saved during a brutal ambush, carried to safety by a soldier who became a casualty moments later. The swirling emotions in his voice suggested that memory had haunted him for decades, and there was a complicated blend of gratitude, guilt, and longing whenever he recalled it. Passengers from several rows behind attempted to lean forward, straining to catch every detail. They were witnessing a real-life story that sounded more moving than any Hollywood script. One soldier's sacrifice, another soldier's life spared, and a son who had never known his father. The flight's attendants, whose primary tasks usually revolved around passenger safety and comfort, stood by quietly, granting the veteran and the younger man the space to explore this profound discovery. A small ripple of motion passed through the seats as the veteran reached into his old duffel bag, rummaging through worn items that carried the weight of countless memories. The hush throughout the cabin intensified. What could he possibly be searching for? Most assumed it might be a set of dog tags or another personal relic from the war. Instead, he retrieved a battered old photograph. Holding it tenderly, he seemed momentarily lost in his own memories. Then, with trembling hands, he offered it to the younger man. The man's eyes widened as he recognized his father's face in that faded snapshot, an image he had never before seen. It depicted a group of soldiers in uniform, smiling in a rare moment of camaraderie, with his father standing close to the veteran who now occupied Stallone's seat. This single photograph answered a question the younger man had been asking for most of his life. What did his father really look like in the thick of war, surrounded by those who truly knew him? He clutched the photo as if it were the key to a locked room in his mind, where the memory of his father resided half-formed, waiting for details that had never emerged. As the veteran quietly shared recollections of his fallen comrade, vivid snapshots of their camaraderie, their fears, their shared resolve, several passengers began discreetly wiping away tears. One of the flight attendants, who had originally approached to check that everyone was seated for takeoff, couldn't bring herself to interrupt. Instead, she stood at a respectful distance, tears welling in her eyes, touched by the magnitude of the story unfolding just a few feet away. Stallone, who had seen his fair share of dramatic moments in real life and on screen, felt a surge of emotion welling in his own chest. It became clear that his generous gesture had, by sheer luck or destiny, set the stage for this reunion of past and present. Just as significantly, it was giving the younger man an unexpected, desperately needed piece of his father's history, one that went beyond military records or official notifications. While the flight made its ascent through light clouds, the sense of reverence inside the cabin deepened. No one complained about overhead lights or seat adjustments. No one grumbled about the seating delay or the fact that they couldn't move freely around the aisle. The usually mundane parts of air travel, like the distribution of drinks or peanuts, seemed irrelevant. The flight staff understood intuitively that this was one of those life-altering moments that transcended ordinary routine. The younger man continued listening to the veteran, who described small anecdotes. A meal the two soldiers once shared in a makeshift camp, a joke told to ease nerves on a particularly dangerous patrol, and especially the final act of bravery that cost the younger man's father his life. The retelling was gentle, laced with decades of remorse and gratitude. The older man admitted how he had carried a profound sense of responsibility, owing everything to the friend who saved him, yet never able to properly repay the sacrifice. Passengers craned their necks to catch each word, fascinated by the raw humanity in front of them. The emotional energy spread from seat to seat, forging a communal atmosphere of compassion, even among total strangers. More than one person silently marveled at how the world can sometimes feel orchestrated, aligning the right people in the right place at precisely the right time. Soon, the veteran revealed an even more cherished item, a small, battered notebook he had maintained during his deployment. Inside, he had scribbled down bits of personal thoughts, the names of fellow soldiers, and short notes he intended to pass along if he ever encountered a loved one back home. Carefully turning to a particular page, he showed the younger man that his father's name had been recorded there alongside a message, a vow to inform the man's future child about the bravery displayed under fire. Though decades had passed, the ink still told a clear story. It was a silent testimonial that the veteran had tried, in his own way, to keep the memory of his friend alive. Now, with trembling hands, he passed the notebook to the younger man. It was clear he had carried it for years, waiting for an opportunity, however improbable, to fulfill that promise. Witnessing all this, Stallone felt a knot tighten in his throat. What had begun as a simple act of trading one comfortable seat for another now felt almost divinely orchestrated. The plane was no longer just a mode of transportation. It had become a vessel for revelation, a floating environment where two strangers could connect over a shared history spanning 50 years. Aware that flight procedures required them to eventually prepare for landing, one of the attendants approached with hesitant steps, quietly encouraging everyone to secure their seatbelts. The plane's captain, speaking over the intercom, reminded passengers of cruising altitude and the expected travel time. Yet even this formal announcement did not pierce the spell of quiet awe. People listened politely, but their thoughts remained anchored to the drama still unfolding in the front cabin. After the safety reminder concluded, a gentle wave of applause broke out once more. This time, not just for Stallone's kindness, but for the raw human connection that had emerged in its wake. The clapping was gentle at first, initiated by a couple of passengers who felt compelled to honor the emotional journey they had just witnessed. Gradually, the applause grew louder, spreading from first class toward the back of the plane. Some travelers who hadn't seen the earlier interactions leaned over to inquire about the commotion, only to be filled in by neighboring passengers who whispered the remarkable story. The applause was not raucous or celebratory in the usual sense. Rather, it felt like a collective exhalation of grief, gratitude, and hope. It was a gesture of respect. For the soldier who did not survive, for the veteran who carried the memory, for the son whose life had just been forever changed. Eventually, the cabin crew signaled that the plane would begin its descent. The outside world, visible through the windows, showed sprawling landscapes bathed in afternoon light. Seatbacks and tray tables were returned to their upright positions, and final instructions were relayed over the speakers. Passengers fumbled for their carry-ons, slipping them back beneath seats or securing them in overhead compartments. But the emotional significance of what had taken place remained tangible. The younger man clutched both the notebook and the photograph, still absorbing stories he had never known about his father's bravery and character. He seemed torn between sorrow for the loss and wonder at the gift of newly discovered truths. The veteran, for his part, looked physically drained, as though this moment of catharsis had demanded all the energy he had. Nevertheless, there was a noticeable lightness about him, the visible relief of finally sharing the burden he had carried for so long. Stallone, preparing to move to an empty seat further back during landing, gently offered a supportive nod to both men. He recognized that a pivotal life moment had occurred, one that would ripple forward for days, months, and years to come. Even when the plane finally touched down, rolling along the runway in a smooth deceleration, no one seemed in a rush to stand or gather their belongings. It was as though they collectively realized they had been part of something bigger than themselves, a solemn tribute to sacrifice and the abiding power of human connection. When the aircraft finally halted and the seatbelt sign chimed off, passengers still hesitated to rise. There was a reverent silence, abruptly punctuated by the overhead bins popping open and the bustle that typically accompanies deplaning. But even amid that pragmatic scramble, people checking missed phone notifications or verifying gate connections, there remained a sense of unity. Many of those disembarking turned to the veteran or the younger man, offering small nods or murmured thanks. A few mouthed words of appreciation to Stallone for setting this series of events in motion. The flight attendants discreetly helped the veteran to his feet, making sure he wouldn't be jostled in the aisle crowd. A few offered their own words of gratitude for his service, patting his shoulder softly. The younger man lingered close, carrying the relics of his father's past with renewed respect and a conviction that he had been given a chance to know his father in ways he never thought possible. As they all reached the aircraft door, the pilot, who had been privately informed of the remarkable scenario, greeted them with a salute. The moment felt both poignant and surreal, as if no simple gesture could fully encapsulate the gratitude swirling within that narrow exit passage. Outside in the bright corridors of the airport terminal, the hustle of the everyday world came rushing back. Business travelers hurried to their next flights, families corralled children, and overhead announcements rattled off gate changes and arrivals. Yet, for the three central figures of this extraordinary tale, Stallone, the veteran, and the younger man, everything seemed touched by a deeper awareness. Stallone offered to assist the veteran with his duffel bag. The older man politely declined, but flashed a look of gratitude that spoke volumes. He explained he had a rental car waiting and assured Stallone that he could handle himself, joking about how he'd been through worse scrapes than the Phoenix airport. The younger man, torn by the possibility of parting ways so quickly, asked if he could stay in touch. The veteran agreed without hesitation, and there was no doubt that they would meet again. Watching them exchange contact information, Stallone felt a quiet sense of fulfillment. He understood now that this chance encounter, an impulsive act of offering up a more comfortable seat, had enabled an event that might otherwise never have happened. In the realm of bright cameras and film sets, he was famous for portraying larger-than-life heroes. Here, in this unplanned moment, he had performed a quiet, real-world gesture that bridged a half-century gap between a father's sacrifice and a son's need for closure. Much later, people would share this narrative with friends and relatives, recounting how they had been on a flight where Sylvester Stallone gave up first class to a veteran, inadvertently reconnecting two lives separated by time and war. Some would call it the greatest real-life movie moment they'd ever witnessed. Others would refer to it as a reminder that small acts of compassion can lead to immeasurable change. For the younger man, his life trajectory would forever be altered. Armed with a notebook filled with poignant scribbles and a photograph capturing his father's vibrant youth, he found a missing piece of his identity. And for the veteran, a burden of 5 decades was finally lifted. He no longer walked alone with memories of a friend who had saved him. He had passed on the torch to the man's son, fulfilling a promise he had silently kept all that time. In the weeks and months that followed, many who heard this story felt compelled to express appreciation for veterans or to research their own family histories. Some reevaluated how they treated strangers, recalling the potent ripple effect born from Stallone's single generous act. And so the story spread, partly through word of mouth, partly through the viral echo chambers of modern media. Each retelling carried the same essential truth. Empathy and respect hold the power to unlock profound healing. Sylvester Stallone himself went on to share a simple reflection about the incident in an understated interview sometime later. Rather than drawing focus to his celebrity status, he emphasized how any person at any moment can choose kindness. That was the real moral. The best among us isn't necessarily the one with the biggest name or the flashiest fortune, but the one who seizes an opportunity to alleviate someone else's struggle. In the end, no Hollywood scriptwriter could have penned a more meaningful finale. A flight from Los Angeles to Phoenix had become the stage for a story that transcended the boundaries of everyday life. It was a narrative about sacrifice, remembrance, and the unexpected intersections that make us realize how deeply interconnected we truly are. As passengers parted ways that day, each took a piece of that unforgettable flight with them. Some carried renewed admiration for veterans. Others harbored a revived commitment to reaching out to loved ones they had lost touch with. Still others felt a moral nudge to perform acts of compassion whenever the chance arose. Everyone understood, in ways large and small, that life's most amazing experiences often begin with a simple choice: to notice someone else's needs and to respond from the heart. No one could say for sure what the future held for the younger man and the veteran. Would they reconnect over coffee in some quiet diner? Would they exchange letters detailing more stories of the father's bravery? Quite possibly. One thing was certain: both were changed irreversibly. The son had found a vital link to his past, and the old soldier had found peace after decades of silent remembrance. Sylvester Stallone walked away, blending into the swirl of travelers with the quiet satisfaction that he had, quite unintentionally, helped write a new chapter for two people bound by history. In a fleeting moment, he offered a seat, and that gesture opened a doorway to revelations that spanned half a century. If there was a lesson to be gleaned by every person who heard the story, it was this: never underestimate the impact of compassion and never doubt the forces that guide us to be in the right place at the right time for someone else's miracle.